and welcome to Idempotence isn't a dirty word. I have surprisingly few jokes around that, for the record. I hope you've all been having a good time at PSConfEU, and this isn't too early a session after the social last night. A huge thank you to PowerShell Conference Europe for allowing me to speak, and by extension, big thanks to each of the sponsors without whom we wouldn't be here. I've met folk from several of the companies, cheating a little bit, work at one of them, and they've been unfailingly lovely. I hope to meet more while I'm here. So, what's going to be covered in this session? Please do tell me if I'm going too fast. I have a tendency to speed up when I'm nervous, so just let me know. So what's going to be covered in this session? We're going to talk about what we're going to talk about. That's fair enough. We're going to cover who I am, why I think I can talk to anybody about this, although it's fairly easy to do so. We're going to look at what idempotence actually is, why you should care about it. We're going to run through a few demos, and there's going to be some time for questions at the end. Having said that, there's also going to be some time for questions during, so if you do have something that you want to ask, just raise your hand and I'll try and spot you. Apologies if I don't. So, let's move on to who I am. I'm James Ruskin. I've been around in IT for a mere decade or so, and in a tale as old as time, or at least the Linux epoch. I started working on a help desk, moved on to a selection of roles that I will sum up as sysadmin, and then really lucked out in moving to a wonderful DevOps engineer role with some amazing people who taught me a lot. The glue that held me together from start to finish and really drove my progression through all of this was certainly PowerShell. So I'd also count myself as a happy-go-lucky PowerShell dev. The desire to script away boring problems and repetitive work, from tickets, write tools to empower others that I worked with, and later craft elaborate CI/CD pipelines, took me to Stack Overflow, a multitude of blogs, and the various wonderful PowerShell communities that I'm sure we're all part of. I'm now working at Chocolatey Software with some lovely people, again, trying to help others simplify and automate all sorts of stuff. So yeah, and though I'm pretty hopelessly awful at replying to anything, you're welcome to find me as JP Ruskin on just about any site that is work-facing. So before we get much further, I think it's probably worth just adding that this is all very much opinionated. Though I think it's quite good and sensible, you're perfectly welcome to disagree. When I started writing PowerShell, I wrote some pretty fragile scripts, more than a few broke partway through, and failed to rerun properly when I did try. When I was trying to learn more, I'd often miss the bigger picture. And when it came to sticking chunks of code together from Stack Overflow, as people are wont to do, it sometimes went wrong. I wish I'd thought more about it. There were certainly a few late nights I caused myself and others by thinking that something would just work, and probably more recently as well than back in the day when I was originally starting out. Another thing I should mention is I have a weird relationship with the word fun. So if I use the word fun and it doesn't seem to make sense in context, just bear in mind I'm probably using it wrong. So let's get to it. What is idempotence? I think this tweet by Patrick McKenzie actually sums it up way better than I've ever managed to, and more eloquently. So it's an operation where you get the same result however many times you run it. As mentioned also above, it's a very fancy word for that simple idea, but I think it can really be applied positively to a lot of things in our sphere. Tobias's talk on Monday noted the joy of asserting something, and being sure that not only was your code dry, but also that your code would simply ensure that the asserted thing was true. Hopefully idempotently, but I don't think I actually saw the function now I think about it. As I sort of mentioned earlier, I started off my journey into PowerShell, DevOps, and all the other sorts of good stuff that we do around here by getting really bored with checklists. Though a paper checklist can be idempotent, they fall down to both potential human error and the loss of time inherent in having somebody trying to run step by step through things. One of my earliest memories of PowerShell was trying to automate the onboarding process. Started with basic stuff, creating an AD user, making sure they were in the correct groups, ensuring the account had Exchange configured correctly, earlier than you might expect. We had to get a PC ready for them, so you'd find a machine, stage it to AD, apply an image, trigger updates and ensure the user was present, install software, hopefully with a quick wink to my employer. All of this could go wrong at any point, and if you assume one misbehaving call for a single part of this process could fail, and make it really difficult to continue the rest of the process without serious manual intervention, or restarting from scratch, I think it's obvious that caring about idempotency and operations being rerunnable and resilient is a good thing. So what do we actually want out of idempotent operations in our world? We probably want things to be rerunnable, as mentioned, and to have a predictable outcome. This really covers the ideal pattern for just about anything, in my opinion, though you could argue that there are some things it's not worth taking the time to develop like this, it almost always will, I think, deliver value. So yeah, I mean, what could be used as examples here? It could be anything from, gosh, that's a big dump of text. The in-depth configuration management tools, simple install scripts, software builds in pipelines. The list of things you probably want to behave nicely is near endless. So as you can imagine, my early scripts, as mentioned, fell over pretty often, but over time I improved their reliability until I felt confident enough to link that script up to Jenkins with some authentication, of course, and let HR create users themselves in one fell swoop. A couple of clicks, bit of text, easy. You can imagine if I had a flaky script that could be run by somebody who wouldn't want to debug it or wouldn't be able to debug it, and was at the mercy of a web interface, you might be a little nervous, but writing things with this stuff in mind will really help just balance that out. So that sort of answers why I think we should care about this stuff. If an operation falls over at any point with an error that should have been recoverable, you're likely to either break the current process or something that's coming up. Is it a big deal? I think so. At least with idempotent code, and when you're writing it as such, you can trust that everything's going to happen as you want, as you expect, without falling over. I enjoyed the pretzel here. And it'll let you share your code for others to use without having to worry about too much support or worry. So how can we get to that point? With a bit of consideration, it's really easy, in my opinion. Again, I should have just left it on that slide at the front and stopped saying that. There's a little more focus on error handling, so not failing out of a long-running script in a way that will leave the environment in a bad state. You'll make sure that everything's properly arranged before you're trying to get stuff in line. And though I put get set, it's probably more accurate to say get test set, ensuring that you need to make the changes you need to make before you do, and that you don't set things blindly. It might take a little bit of time to get used to, and a little bit of thought when you're doing it initially, but as said, I think it really does deliver a great return on invested time. So, we like demos. Let's have a look at a few examples, hopefully.
Sorry, you said one thing you should not do. I just missed it. You went through a list of things to do, and then there was one thing, don't do this.
I think that was me slightly self-deprecatingly suggesting that I should stop saying, in my opinion, given that I had a slide on it. Sorry. My fault there. So, demos. Yes, of course. Sorry. Please let me know if this is big enough in the back. I have a very simple test script for reading here.
You have young eyes.
Sorry. Is everybody okay with that? Brilliant. So let's start off with an example from earlier, from the tweet as it happens. As you can imagine, something that can fit in a tweet is going to be pretty short. This one is maybe ridiculous, and I slightly can't believe that I've actually saved this to a script file. But hey, it saves typing, right? So yeah, 2 + 2, that is idempotent. You're never going to get a different result out of that, with luck. We're not using JavaScript, so it should be okay. We could make this into a function, but I feel like that'd be wasting your time and mine, so let's just move on. We've got some simple PowerShell stuff here. We're actually going to use another example from earlier. We're going to update some files. So in this case, we're going to use a host's example file, which is only mildly tarnished from earlier testing. We've got a couple of functions that I will import. Very simple functions. Simply take an IP and, well, an FQDN, and then we're going to add that content to the theoretical host file. We can run this multiple times, but actually it's going to look a bit messy. The host file will handle it, of course, but that's not entirely the point. And of course, even when we've got several duplicate keys here, we can still continue running it with the same thing, and it will end up with multiple entries for each thing. So if we just blow that away again. What I'd suggest in this sort of thing is we want to learn a little more and think a little more. Same concept of a function. We're going to take an IP and a host name, key value in many ways. We have the same file path, but in this case, we're going to grab all the current content from the file. We're going to filter it by lines that don't match the values that we care about, and then we're going to remove them by setting the content to everything that doesn't match, and then add that same line. So this actually should end up, hopefully, with a vaguely idempotent function in that, as many times as you run it, you're going to have one change that happens, and it's going to be the same change every time, and hopefully there'll be no more changes. So, if I run this once, fair enough, we have our entry. If I run this a bunch more times, then we should end up with exactly the same file. Yeah, cool. It may be a little less than ideal, because it does slightly lazily move the entry to the end of the file, but it's one change, you always end up with the same result. There's no, yeah. So, again, reaching back to earlier examples provided, if we have a look at some user creation, for example, again, we're just going to take some lazy parameters that, in theory, will work, set up user account, and then add it to some groups. What happens, though, if there were hiccups between creating the AD user and adding your group members? Obviously, you might be running on the DC, but that's not always going to help and not always going to happen. So, it's potentially not rerunnable. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, James, this is your fault. You put error action preference stop. But if you do try and rerun this again, it's going to potentially error out on the new AD user, and the user will never get added to the two groups. If you can imagine this being scaled up to some gigantic batch job, you can see that could potentially end up with some horrendous stuff going on. I heard an example earlier of a series of paychecks being adjusted badly, although that doesn't entirely match up. But what I would say is instead, we should get some very similar stuff. But instead, we should test to see if the user exists. We should generate our list of groups that we care about, and then we should say for each of those groups, we want to check whether the account is contained and then add it to the group. In this way, the function or script should be rerunnable in every sense. You can run this as many times as you want. It's not going to try and, it's not going to screw things up. But it should, even if you have a hiccup here, run through and actually add the guy to the groups. So rolling on, we have some module building, which is, in this case. Very simple module, quite boring, returns a random number. Not sure why you'd ever want that, but it's simple and quick. Excuse me. So we see that this sort of script should work nicely on my machine. Pretty much guaranteed with any luck. However, if we flip over to a relatively clean machine that is going to be hopelessly small, I'm really sorry, could somebody remind me of the shortcut to the zoom tool? Sorry? Thank you.
You mean the built-in one?
Yes, that would be. I thought it ended with equals. No matter. Yeah, I guess, there we go. So yeah, as you can see, this build script would probably fail horribly when running on a fresh new VM, because if we do run it, we can't find the command build module. It doesn't exist on the system. We don't have the module installed. On top of that, we're going to try and sign the thing with a certificate that doesn't exist. Never going to happen. Additionally, if we actually ran this from any random location, build module would probably go and try and either build no modules, a different module, or a selection of modules. That could be my fault for not specifying, but nonetheless. So if we take some of these ideas again, and we say, okay, we're going to want to make sure that we have the belt and braces approach. We're going to install all our prerequisites. We're going to make sure that if we don't have module builder, we're going to add the NuGet provider. We're going to make sure that the PS repository is trusted and install any prerequisite modules before reverting anything else. We're then going to push into the PS script root and build module, which will, excuse me, I'm going to cough on it. And then build the module, and only if the signing certificate is present, we want to try and sign it. And this, instead, should run through, install the module, and then build, which is perfect for any roaming build agents or fresh developers or anything like that. Again, it's just being able to ensure that you are going to get the output you require. So here we have that wonderful function in a few places. Going on to installing software, it's obviously something that can, to quote something I hear quite frequently, grow arms and legs. I'm sure everyone's written a quick script to set up an environment with some software, and it can go places. We've all probably done that. You can obviously write something quite simple, just invoke the installer with some arguments. But what happens if this is the first installer of many, or a dependency, and it throws an error, requires a reboot? Any number of things could go wrong. So you want to write some handling. You want to say, if this isn't installed, then we'll install it. Sorry, point being from the last slide that if it threw an error when it was already installed and you reran the installer. Something like this might help adjust for that. And if you wanted to go further, you could add handling. You could ensure that not only had the application not been installed already, but that the installer had finished installing before we actually went on to the next thing. And then if the exit code wasn't one of our appreciated ones, it will throw an error, but it'll throw an error in an appropriate and predictable way. Of course, and sorry again for the slight nod, I'd probably use Chocolatey for that. It's going to do better for me. If we have time, which I think we do. We have Ansible Playbooks, wherein you can run, you want them to be rerunnable. You want them to be rerunnable in an automatic and frequent manner, so that you can do just about anything and ensure that the state of your environment is predictable and up to date. You can obviously do just about anything with them. In this case, we're going to use an imaginary user being added to an imaginary API. So in this case, we could be quite naive again. We could just create the user regardless of what's going on, and just create each user. But that, again, has the potential to return errors where the user exists, obviously hugely depending on what's going on. So instead, we could run a more complex thing and get the current users from this theoretical API, and we could create each user that doesn't exist before moving on and setting any additional information that we require. I was going to dip briefly into the Ansible Windows collection, as they had several good examples of idempotently written functionality, but Paul actually did a great talk on that yesterday, so I'd recommend checking his out instead of me diving into it here. DSC, finally, is something that should be pretty good at this sort of thing. The whole idea is that it should be able to rerun and result in a desired state. In this case, again, we're going to use an example of setting some values in a file, in this case, a Jenkins configuration. So having some simple and relatively untested Jenkins config thing, as I've stripped a bunch of stuff out of it, DSC basically has the idea that you need to declare get, set, and test functions, or methods, at least. And they should return the appropriate types. So a test should return a Boolean that should indicate whether or not you need to apply changes to the object or resource. The set shouldn't return anything, instead just adjusting it, setting it to the correct state. And the get should ideally return the state and be used in the test. It's already using the patterns we want, which is great. However, there's a fair few examples out there, probably quite old ones at this point, that have potentially quite lazy gets and tests that you may just return a true and have something rerunning all the time. That's probably not the best pattern and won't result in what you want. I think there I've actually run out of examples. I may have rushed through some of my notes, I apologize.
This is awesome. Yeah. You found a good way of showing people that your module is idempotent, or instead of just writing it in your help. It seems like it's not something we do in PowerShell for some insane reason.
I think it would be a good thing to extol. Thank you. Sorry. So let's flip back to the slides, and then we can. Sorry. Go horribly wrong. So, any questions?
So we looked at a couple of different ways of making scripts. Do you have a preferred method between DSC, kind of PowerShell scripting, Ansible?
I would definitely say that, for me at least, it depends on what you're trying to do, what your target is. I personally very much enjoy DSC resources, but in a lot of cases you're looking for something that will just run a PowerShell script. If you're deploying everything via Ansible or using a specific configuration management tool, and that's obviously the thing you should target, though you can write extensive Ansible resources that would use PowerShell and kind of mangle the two together, it seems best to use best practices in the thing you're using. Sorry for a it depends answer.
Have you come across a module that helps with idempotency?
I haven't. Oh, sorry.
Much of what you have done as well, and it seems like there's some design patterns that goes through everything. I guess that rather than just would say that the DBA tools also have a lot of patterns for doing idempotency, and it might be cool to add a great module supporting idempotency.
So the question is,
For installing, importing modules, verifying different stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be very sensible. The question there, and sorry for not repeating your question, was that had I found a module that assists with writing idempotent functionality in PowerShell? My answer, sadly, was no, not yet. And sorry if that was a very shortened version of your question. That is true. You can test with, yes, you can test things with Pesta.
I'll say that we actually run, it's not necessarily a script, it's more a binary, but to actually assert the state of the system alert if it's straight from a given configuration, given policies applied, given settings. So that's something you can consider if you want to run that on schedule to actually alert when things go wrong.
Yeah.
That's just another fail-safe.
And you're using Pesta for that in this case?
No,
oh, sorry.
It's entirely separate from any of the things that apply it. It's something that runs later on a schedule that asserts the state of the system is what we want it to be and alerts us if it's not.
Okay, yeah. So yes, you can write or have something that will go on and later assert that everything is in order, and have that running on a schedule to ensure that you're doing so.
So we're here at the PowerShell conference. You mentioned DSC, talked about PowerShell, talked a lot about Ansible. Rather than giving me a it depends answer, what's your favourite tool to use to
probably just straight PowerShell. Sorry, the question was, what's my favorite of all of the different ways you can possibly write things idempotently? And I guess my answer would be straight PowerShell in this case.
Even with PowerShell, you have to add all the bits from about it because it's not naturally idempotent. So Ansible is, it's DSC is, PowerShell is not. So you prefer the writing, the scaffolding, I suppose is the best.
I mean, full warning on the this is full of opinions bit, but I quite like reinventing the wheel. Not a good habit. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. To dip back to the Ansible modules, the Ansible Windows community module, there are so many things in there that I use and enjoy using, but perhaps quite enjoy my own solutions as well. That's a very half-hearted answer.
I think your comment on get test check is kind of a good method, like kind of a good check for us when we're writing anything, right? I mean, like Rob said with DSC, we're depending on someone who's already done those pieces of work, but if we're going to write PowerShell, it's on us to make sure we do those steps.
Yeah, and you can be sure they're being done because you've done them. Yeah. On the get test set thing, it's good that you're re-implementing yourself because you can be sure that all of these things are being done. It's a great pattern to have, and I'm sorry if this is not.
No, it was more of a comment on your comment. It's a good reminder. I like it.
Anything else at all? Okay. So I'm hoping that this talk has had the expected outcome I had for it, that you're all a little bit at least convinced that idempotence is a good thing. I hope we can agree that idempotent operations should behave predictably and deliver the same result regardless of how many times it's been run. The writing functionality that is idempotent can reassure both users and yourself that stuff is just going to work and leave you feeling more confident about unattended and automatically running scripts. And that it only takes a little more effort and is probably good practice. Thank you very much for coming along. If anyone wants to continue chatting about this, I'll be around outside, although actually probably stressing out my talk at 11 for a little bit, or you'll be able to find me at the chocolate booth later today, trying to hand out the last few remaining t-shirts and stickers. Have great days.